In the part 1, I talked about my life's journey, especially related to the spiritual element and the social element, and how I have been learning and finding the way moving forward. One of the points was that I was a curious guy, I have been, and I wanted to experience life instead of just thinking about what to do or conceptually figuring out. So no limit, exploration, that was the orientation, and that has been the case even to this age, except I have much more focused approach. But in this part 2, I want to go from that adolescent life of the first love to perhaps around the work, starting of my work as a nuclear engineer, even involved in the Fukushima safety analysis. Perhaps I should mention a few words about my first love. Probably 17 or 18 years old, and it didn't work well. As I understand, that's very typical. But that's kind of like one of the major suffering, and it lasted 3 months or more. And at that time, I had this diary exchange with my friend. So I talked about it, and he was more of an intellectual guy, so he was giving some advices or feedback. So that was kind of interesting. Anyway, that faded away, and I get involved with my friends, doing sports, having fun. Eventually, I went to Waseda University, BSEE, electrical engineering. The idea there was to explore the future, also related to my interest that was raised by my knowing Thomas Alva Edison. So, Bachelor's of Science, Electrical Engineering sounded like an interesting thing to do. But as it turned out, as much as I had so much fun in my high school days, not like many others who had to go through the entrance exam, as much as I got inside the university, I kept on playing. I did some hitchhiking trip around the world. I did the hitchhiking trip around Japan. A few different cases, and I learned the knack of it. And it was as if to study the world, how people live, not from my narrowly defined way that is related to my family and the education, but it is totally different. The reason for hitchhiking is that I didn't have much money, and I just wanted to explore the world. I have so much memories meeting different people. Most of them, 99% of them, very kind. And I felt I get to see the world from, I call it shop floor or ground level. In fact, this became one of my way of assessing the organization after I became management consultant. So not just talking at the top management level about the corporate strategy, I also check at the shop floor level how things are happening, if people are understanding, appreciating what they do, being creative. So whatever I did, this hitchhiking trip, meeting people, not knowing which way to go often, and get to know new person and be able to talk whatever is the subject, young or old. That was quite interesting. As much as I did that hitchhiking, I was also explored varieties of sports. I guess swimming, diving, skiing, many traveling, but also musically I started the band. This is like Hawaiian or standard or jazz with our friend. 5 of us. I played flute and saxophone. I had quite a few friends, so we had lots of things to do. Playing mahjong was one, but we explored all different things. Also traveling together. The relationship woman was somewhat active. I don't think I have much to say, except there was one woman I got more involved, but because of the orientation of her family's direction and also the state of where I was at the time, we spent maybe a year and a half or so, but that ended up with nothing afterward. Since I had an interest, I wanted to go to New Zealand, as I found a way from my friend's friend, so that I contacted the farmer in New Zealand so that I arranged a way so that I can go visit, getting the visa. But when I talked to my father that I want to spend 1 year off from the university, he said maybe that's not a good idea. And for whatever the reason, I kind of regret, which I hate to do, but because of the Japanese typical way and the respect to my father, and his logic was not quite agreeable, but I ended up not doing it. I'm sure if I could do it at the time, I may have learned and opened up my world much in a different dimension than what I went through. But that is it. As it turned out, whatever the case was, maybe 30 years later, I go back to New Zealand, which I can talk about it, but even have a house, and I have visited the country like 25 times. So the attraction of New Zealand stayed with me. But every now and then I still thought that if I spent 1 year in New Zealand, that may have changed my life's direction, the course, quite heavily. I had a short trip, 1 month trip to Hawaii, the first overseas trip. And one thing I can talk about, that's a funny thing, is that I should have learned English by that time, maybe even 4 or 5 years. But when I was at the McDonald's asking for the hamburger, my pronunciation was like a hamburger or something, so that I didn't get the hamburger, pointing that how bad the education was. Not because I was a bad student, but I think their way of teaching was very feudal, like many of the cases that you find in Japan, unfortunately. I played quite well with friends and explored whatever I could. I wish, again, the time outside of Japan could have been more, but that's what it was. As much as I enjoyed being a student and free time, the exploration was the main thing. But since I didn't do much study, toward the end of my time at the university, I thought I should do something, to see my limit. So the last year and a half, perhaps, I was taking the seat up front and spending time more focused instead of playing mahjong and skipping the class, which shouldn't be the case, but that was accepted at the time. So what I did was that I did some graduation thesis about the electroluminescence, it's called. It's a thin film that you create in the vacuum to see if you can have this thin film emitting light. So that was my graduation thesis, and I often spent overnight doing the experiment. As much as I was talking about Thomas Alva Edison, I was going through somewhat similar in my imagination to do various experiences and figuring out how can this be done. Anyway, that got a good grade and I graduated. So that was pretty much about the university days. Just reflecting, lots of playful time, friends, exploration, and the only missing element was my lack of study in English and spending time overseas. I joined Toshiba after graduation, and with the engineering degree, I found a job in the nuclear power business. So I even became an engineer to study or analyze the nuclear safety analysis for Fukushima. I visited the nuclear power plant here and there, and that was interesting, especially related to safety analysis, also involved with some of the committee organization at the government level, and also sharing the ideas from the overseas companies like General Electric. Eventually, I spent 3 years with them representing Toshiba. So those collaboration in the technology transfer area, as well as connecting to government and utility companies like TEPCO, which is the owner of the Fukushima nuclear power plant, and deal with them how to process the licensing to approve to plant the nuclear power plant in Japan. I may have been involved in 5 or 6, maybe more, a project. But what I found out is that there are lots of bright people, and the bottom line is that what I thought is that what's the point of my spending the next 20 years or 30 years designing the nuclear power plant? It sounds very repetitive and not stimulating. Plus, they're a bunch of bright people. So I thought they can do the job. So I started to be more interested in the management and departing from the engineering field, because the management itself in Japan at the time was still somewhat primitive, if you call that. They have their way, wonderful, but the Western approach, like a Drucker, was one of the books I read about the management. Those ideas are still fresh, very fresh. So I thought, well, that may be the area that I want to focus on. So again, my exploratory nature and not fearful to jump into the pond without knowing much, but thinking that this is a place. And one point, I was visiting my aunt who got married with American military. He was the husband. And there I found a Newsweek article, I believe, and their ranking of the business school in the US. And out of that I found, okay, Stanford, this is number 1, or Harvard. So, okay, that may be the direction I can explore without any fear, but the imagination that in Japan maybe we need something to connect to the way that the US management practice, that can be utilized in Toshiba business. So as much as I represented Toshiba at the General Electric, this is in Silicon Valley, San Jose, which was a great experience by itself, and some potential trouble popping up because I was so interested in the way California life, openness, pragmatic, entrepreneurial. So that gave me a sense of wanting to do more. So I took some course at the General Electric about management, and eventually I could convince my bosses, up high in Toshiba, that I should be sent representing Toshiba, or they paid for the tuition for the business school. So 1979, when I was 29 years old, 1979 is 48, 1979 29 years old, I applied and got into Stanford so that I earned the MBA, Master of Business application, while I was there. So that's additional experience in California, and to get to know more friends, lots of bright people again, different area compared to engineering. But one of the point that I remember at the Stanford is that, okay, that may be interesting, but I was to go back to Japan and Toshiba. So I wasn't quite sure what may be my career goal from that point. But one thing I detected is that the management should be connected to people's becoming happy. So I came up with some thesis of how to achieve it, not just the financial result, and the accounting, finance, marketing, organization and all that, but rather to think of all the people involved in the process. Maybe that's the influence I got from the Japanese way of management. And at the time, I think there was a book called Japan as Number One. Azra Fogel, I think was his name, because of the Japanese approach of empowering employees, and connecting to that was the high quality, low cost product or the services, that their management system had the unique approach compared to the US management system, such as Drucker. I even called Drucker at one point, and he was very familiar with Japanese approach. Or later I talked with Dr. Deming, who is known to have transferred this idea of quality management to Japan. And that has the element of the combining the Western and Eastern approach together. And that is what I found out, that's an interesting niche that I can put myself in. But without much future projection at the time, because I was to go back to Toshiba, I didn't go much farther. So I went back to Toshiba. The funny thing related to the spiritual pursuit is that almost at the end of my graduation, MBA program at Stanford, I stopped by at this bookstore called the Printers Inc. I don't know if they are there anymore. But as I wandered around, there was a book by Daisetsu Suzuki called Zen and Japanese Culture. I didn't know much about Daisetsu. I did go through some of the Zen training in Japan, maybe a few days of sitting, but not much. But when I opened up this book, there are lots of interesting stuff in there. Also, I remember that my friends from the school, Stanford, my colleagues, asked me about the Buddhism or Zen, and I couldn't answer. So that stimulated me to look into this book and realize that the Japanese culture, lots of stuff. There's a swordsmanship, a flower arrangement, tea ceremony, and more. Lots of the flavor that I'm somewhat familiar with had the element of those Zen and the Buddhism behind it. And that was very stimulating because MBA business program is more of the left brain, the logic, finance, profitability, marketing. But this is the opposite almost, or incorporating the business. But at the time I felt that it's almost a totally different dimension of management, or the way the Japanese has operated, which is harmony-oriented, even though there's hierarchical structure and all of that. But they had less of the logical, scientific management process, but more of a almost like a tribe mentality. That may be extreme to say it, but rather a harmonious relationship, human to human relationship. So when I realized was that the Japanese based upon Zen and harmony and close to nature, respect for nature, respect the individual with each other, that brought me a sense that this element is part of the reason for the Japanese to be more coherent, to work together, to produce the right product, good quality, right price for the customers. So as much as Drucker was one of the ones that I respected, but in Japan there are many companies, Sony or Matsushita. So I started to read lots of books about Matsushita, especially because his background is from the apprenticeship and not too much of logic, but more of a hands-on, experience-based approach, humanistic, and connecting to the people's mind and heart. So I studied Matsushita. I've read maybe 20 books or more. And on top of what I have learned at Stanford, I was now meshing the Western to the Japanese. And then I left Toshiba because the reason is not because I was not happy in Toshiba, but in the sense that their management style of how to approach the company, management, and having the guy coming back from the US with the Stanford MBA, they didn't know how to deal with me. And I thought, well, what do I do? I remember one day I went to the nearby temple and there was a big vase and there's water and there's one goldfish swimming. And I felt like if I stay in Toshiba, I'll be like a fish, one fish in the vase, there's no way out. So I struggled, I don't know how long, maybe a couple months at least, and then decided to leave the company, which is very unusual in the Japanese company. They had the term called the lifetime employment. So I'm against to the typical way or Japanese way, business way, and I decided to leave. But I remember talking to my father, and going through this process was not so easy. But given what I've learned and the opportunity I had there in Toshiba was limited, I wanted to explore whatever I can contribute. That was when I was 31 years old. I'm starting to figure out, what could be my life's job. So, more like an extension of MBA program, I joined the management consulting group called the Boston Consulting Group. This is located in Tokyo. So I talked to them and I was hired with much better remuneration and involved in the corporate strategy. I lasted for 2 years. Here again, there are lots of bright people, and I wasn't sure if I want to keep doing this consulting work with the BCG, Boston Consulting Group, for how long. And typically, people work, I don't know how many hours, long hours, and make a good presentation. But somehow, it's not so operation-oriented, and the work is to come up with a strategy and how to make a good presentation to impress the audience, to sell the idea. And that itself is nothing wrong, utilizing lots of strategic ideas that the Boston Consulting Group is famous about. And I was involved in not just the Japanese companies, but the European and the US companies. So that was fun to travel and get to see different cities, people, companies, and the problem, how to go over to implement strategy or come up with a strategy and implement them. Somehow it didn't fit with me, so while I stayed for 2 years, I decided to move back to the US, which is based upon one simple book, another book that I read called The In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters. And one of the lines in the book said there was a GM worker being laid off after him working for 15 years or so. And he was talking to Tom Peters, saying that I realize we are not making a good quality car at a good price, but in the last 15 years, he has never been asked one single suggestion. So that was the main goal for me. There's something has to be done in terms of the management, in terms of the strategy, in terms of how people can work better to utilize their talent. So I decided to move to the US. I found the company and work as a consultant, and the idea behind is related to waste elimination, so that people can be involved in the process of coming up with ideas, even management. So it's called the lean production, like Toyota was famous about. But I thought I can expand that, so that I wrote eventually 3 books related to that. So that's another important juncture in my life, to leave Japan to the US to work. I felt like I'm parachuting into the desert, but I had the company I lined up, and from there I start to explore what can be done. So maybe that's good enough about the time I had since high school and start to do the work. I can talk about the marriage, but maybe I can talk about it in the next segment. What I can synthesize here is that in this period of the age, say 18 to 33 or so, was the moment or the period that I was exploring different directions to figure out which way to go, what skill to use. And somehow I could manage, although I couldn't go to New Zealand, but I found a way to relate to Toshiba, General Electric, and to management and Stanford. So I think I can say that was an interesting period. I should say I was lucky that I found this path. And then what happens next is the next question that I can talk in the next part. But at least I had the idea. So that's the basis of where I found to figure out what to do in my future. Spiritually, I had this encounter with Daisetsu Suzuki and his book. Even when I was busy with the consulting business, I started to read more of Daisetsu, but also Konosuke Matsushita, who founded Panasonic, because as mentioned, there are lots of books he wrote, and he had a different viewpoint of the Japanese style management, perhaps, along with Toyota, very good company. So studying those, studying the cases in the US and others from the Stanford and related to BCG, Boston Consulting, working in the international companies, and also sharing how the Japanese are managing and how Japanese management are different. So that was a very interesting period to look into and figure out the future.